Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the March 14th meeting of the District Advisory Council. I know we have a few people coming in. I know I got caught in traffic on the way here, so it's understandable if a couple people straggle in here on us a few minutes late. I don't know if everybody's had an opportunity to review the minutes from our February 20th, 2019 meeting. If you have, I would at this time entertain any comments or requests for changes or corrections, or if there are none, I would certainly entertain a motion to approve the minutes. I have a motion to approve from our esteemed vice chairperson. Is that your call? Do we have a second? We have a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Duly approved. This time we'll entertain public comment from any non-DAC members on our agenda items. I do want to remind everybody of a couple housekeeping items. It seems that we've had some people not signing in. As a reminder to you that we have the sign-in books and the breakout sessions, so that's when you should be sure to sign in to show your attendance at the school. I guess it was brought to my attention that we had more than a few people called in to say that they had been marked as absent when they said they were here, and apparently they had not signed in with some of the issues. So just a reminder to do that. And the other thing that the executive board discussed is we just kind of remind everybody of the speaking decorum when you come up to the podium. At one time, this board had a sort of very strict limit of a 3-minute policy. We've had some very good back and forth between our folks and the presenters that has, you know, led to some productive stuff, and so we're not necessarily wanting to re-implement that immediately, but we want to remind everyone to keep your questions short and pointed, and that the questions are to be about something that affects the district as a whole, or your school as a whole, and not about individual questions for your student or your family. So with that in mind, again, we're going to try to continue to foster dialogue between our members and the staff folks that present to us to move things forward, but please keep those things, be mindful, and Cedric and I will do our best to keep everybody sort of on task and keep the meeting moving along according to schedule. It seems that Ms. Gittens has also been caught in the traffic, so we're going to defer the board update till later on in the meeting. And so at this time, if Ms. Duncan are we ready? Okay. Introduce to you Ms. Jessica Duncan, our Director of Exceptional Student Education.
All right, Jessica. Good evening. So we have a number of members of our Exceptional Student Education Department here to talk to you tonight. Some will be presenting, some will be available to talk to you during breakout sessions if you have additional questions. So our topic tonight is the least restrictive environment and inclusion. And we're going to talk about our district's background on inclusion, where we are now with inclusion. The reason that this is an important focus for us is because inclusion is important across the board for different races, different religions, people with disabilities. Our focus tonight, because we're coming to you from a special education standpoint, is students with disabilities. And it's exceptionally important to us because we start from when students come to us in pre-K or kindergarten to already start talking and thinking about what skills are they going to need to be successful members of our community when they leave our school district. All of our work is designed to have them exit school and be prepared to be active participants in their community. And inclusion is important. And students with disabilities haven't been included, and you'll hear a little bit more about that, for as long as you might think. But it's important because our society is inclusive. When our students leave here with disabilities, they're not going to go to the Publix for students with disabilities. They're not going to go to the movie theater for students with disabilities. They're going to access those same things in the community that all of of us access. And then on the flip side, this is important for students who don't have disabilities to learn those skills, to be inclusive, to understand that our differences are what make us special and unique. We don't have to all look the same. We don't have to all talk the same, that we all have value and we all have strengths, and that's what we want to capitalize in each individual. So I'm going to introduce to you now two of our presenters, Lisa Flannery and Rachel Taylor. They work specifically with inclusion in our district. That's their primary focus. They do a number of other things, but that's their primary focus. So I want to turn this over and let them get started and have them share some district and national information related to inclusion.
Thank you, Jessica. It's wonderful to be here tonight. We appreciate that the DAC committee wants to hear more about inclusion. Part of our team here tonight with us is our ESE coordinators. So we have Susan Ellinger, Amy Burke, our assistant director, Teresa Bowen, and there's also Amy Stoner-McLean with us tonight, and several other district ESE members, so you will get to know them a little bit better when we go into the breakout sessions. For now, what we really want to start talking about, I like to call it the elephant in the room, but if you notice, he's a really cute, happy elephant. And so when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about something that encompasses a lot of different wording. We're talking about outcomes, collaboration. What is it that comes together to benefit all of our students? When we talk more about inclusion, we have multiple definitions, and we'll share those with you as we go through. But it's really about being responsive to the learning needs of all students, not just students with disabilities. It's how do we meet the needs of all of the diverse learners and making sure that they're getting the supports, the services, and the increased level of differentiation that those students need to be successful. So it's really about the responsive learning environment to benefit all students, not just students with a disability.
Hi there, and I'm Rachel Taylor, also a learning resource specialist for the district in exceptional student education. So when we think of that word inclusion, it's not really, when we're talking about students with disabilities, it's not something that's directly written into IDEA or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So there's really different perspectives on, depending on what lens you are using, that you might take a look at it and think of it in a few different ways. So there's that legal perspective, which is that we have that wording to the greatest extent appropriate. And remember that we're talking about students with disabilities and individual plans for them. So students with disabilities are educated alongside peers who do not have disabilities. Again, to the greatest extent appropriate for each individual student. When we take an educational perspective and add that to that, we say that to the maximum extent possible, students with IEPs receive supports just where the curriculum is being taught, which is in general education classrooms and a variety of other places along the continuum. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's a requirement for that continuum of supports, and there's that need for looking at each individual rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. Societally speaking, it's simply this: all students who happen to have disabilities are accepted and part of our community and our schools just like anybody else. So, so that's that different lenses.
So just like we were talking about when I started this discussion, we must think about their relationships when they are children. Their classmates and neighbors will grow into their coworkers and friends later in life.
Evening, everyone. Just so you know, I know Rachel mentioned that you won't see the definition of inclusion in IDEA or any of those particular laws, but what Florida has done in Florida statutes is actually define what it means for the state of Florida. So a couple of years ago, this was put into place, and you'll see this definition. You have it in your folder, and there's some key words there that kind of highlight some of the thoughts and ideas behind inclusive education that Rachel mentioned. For example, students with disabilities are a valued member of the classroom and the school community. So this is the definition that you will see for Florida, along with some of the other things we talked about earlier.
So this is what we call the continuum of services. And what we know is we always consider general education first for all students. However, we offer a wide variety of services within our districts. So if you take a look at this, looking at that green area, that's a targeted area from the state, but it's really about 80% of the time, and that's during a school week, that a student is being educated alongside their general education peers. This could be a co-taught class, a support facilitation class. That comes in it could be a resource pullout, but that's that green targeted area. But we also offer other areas, such as the 40 to 79% of the time that a student is spending within learning alongside their general education peers, the 39%, and then the separate day school or self-contained class. So as you know, we have Buckingham and Royal Palm. Those are separate day schools. We have separate programs such as II, or intensive intervention. We have behavior intervention, BI classes. We have SE classes, social emerging. We also have social functioning. Those classes in it themselves, although they're typically separate classes, that doesn't mean that those students don't get what we call pushed out to gen ed or attend gen ed classes during some parts of their day. So even those separate classes can be extremely inclusive within our classes, within our environment.
So for this slide here, what you're looking at is the state target for inclusion. So the state target is actually 85%. We have a number of things in exceptional student education that we are working on and that we are currently working to improve, and this is one of those areas. So although we have a considerable number of students who are included, who access general education supports or services for part of their day, we are still slightly shy of the target. So you can see, if you look at here, that the state target is, the state goal is 85%. The state target for last year was 83%, and we were at 80. So although we are still working to meet the goal, we've made considerable gains over the years from 2012 to 13. So it's a slow process. We want to make sure that students are included responsibly. So although we still have a little bit of ways to meet the target and we're still working to do that, we aren't willing to just have students be where they're not necessarily going to be successful. So this is our state information. And then we're going to have some information about, when we do include students, how we access support and services and how schools are able to receive some of those resources to help those students be successful.
So part of what we do as the inclusion team is constantly supporting schools, whether it be in the office working with staffing specialists on how to calculate the LRE, the least restrictive environment, whether it's going out to classes and providing instructional coaching and support for collaborative teachers, whether they're a co-teach, support facilitator, resource push-in or pull-out. We provide coaching support after they've attended our trainings. We've provided trainings for over 260 staff members, whether they were administrators, teachers, or paraprofessionals so far this year. Working with paraprofessionals, what we focus in on is how to be that bridge, how to walk beside the student, help them, but also how to scaffold that level of need. So we're not doing things for them. We're not sitting next to them, maybe sitting behind them to make sure that they're part of that group and part of their classroom. So it's using those strategies to make sure that we are doing inclusive type behaviors with our students and building that independence. So the trainings also have been on differentiated instruction. Flexible scheduling is the state's process for how we implement and design the master schedule, including students with disabilities. So we start first with students with disabilities. We look at their level of need. Then from there, we pick the highest level of need and those students that need the most support and start designing the master schedule around those. It's easier to do those with the highest level of need and then build in the extras afterwards. So that is a state process that we've been lucky to do in Lee County for several years now. We have just started the process for this year. We've had many schools reach out. I think last year we worked on this at least 40 different schools within our county. So that is what we call flexible scheduling. There's also something called caseload analysis or caseload management. So once students arrive at the school, considering in the fall, maybe you've lost some students. Maybe you have a whole new group of students. Maybe you get a couple of students that are really high needs. So caseload analysis looks directly at each teacher's caseload and starts looking at balancing it out to make sure that we're being equitable and making sure that every support need for our students can be covered. And then we also collaborate with very discretionary projects. Tressa Duncan is here with us tonight. She is part of our Florida Inclusion Network specialist. So she's also one of our collaborative partners.
One of the, and it's coming up on the next slide, perfect, thank you. Things that the state has put in place, and it's also a part of Florida statute, is that every 3 years, the state has asked that, or has required that every school and every school district complete a self-assessment and an internal assessment of where we are based on data as it relates to specific indicators regarding inclusive practices, best practices for inclusion, actually. So that's in process now. Our schools, Lee County, this is their second round of doing it. So we did it 3 years ago, and now we're up. Our schools are doing it, and it's being completed this year. And this will take place in another 3 years, where we are asking districts and each school in that district to tell us where you are. Self-assess yourself as it relates to inclusive education. And this is just one other another extra piece that's in place to monitor and track what we're doing to show that we're increasing and getting better in what we do for children with disabilities, for all children.
So this isn't a slide, I just want to jump in here for a minute. So on the last slide, it mentioned Finn and Fiddler. So if you work in ESC or associated with ESC, you know we use a lot of acronyms and letters to describe what we do. So Finn, and I know Lisa did say the Florida Inclusion Network is a discretionary project. So they are not, they work with us, but they're not part of the district. So Tressa Duncan, if you have questions or anything later, she's joined us this evening. Dr. Phillips is with the Fiddlers, which is the Florida Diagnostic Learning and Resource System. So she is here as well. They support Child Find, which is seeing if children are can access services between the ages of 3 and 5 prior to them being school age. So if you have specific questions of anybody in those discretionary projects, they will also be here with us this evening.
So this is just kind of a funny, but it's really about a student that's in a wheelchair, and the man there shoveling the snow is really saying, I'm sorry, you have to wait so long. I'm sorry you have to wait so long. I have to get these stairs done so all the kids can come in. And basically the little boy says in the wheelchair, well, if you just did the ramp, we could all get in. And so what we're really saying to teachers is it's not about working harder. It's maybe about working smarter, thinking about what the barriers are for all of our students or some of our students, and if we would just do that barrier and reduce that barrier, maybe we're clearing the path for more students than we think, those with and without disabilities. The district has implemented what we call high-yield strategies, and there's 5 chosen strategies that are research-based, evidence-based best practices. And the purpose of this, if you see the colorful wheel, that's called Hattie's Barometer of Influence. And any instructional strategy that's higher than a 0.4, what we're saying is a desired effect. So it's more than just having a good teacher. It's more than, yes, you just showed up to class, so you're going to learn just through osmosis. These are powerful strategies that show more gain than with just being in the classroom. So I've listed the 5 strategies there. As you can see, they have a much greater than 0.4 effect. And although these are used for gen ed students, really all of our kids are gen ed students first. So what's good for them is also good for us. So we should be using these strategies in the classroom, practicing these with our students, and knowing that what is going on in our gen ed classrooms is benefiting our students as well. They're all of our students.
So we have lots and lots more students over time who happen to have intellectual disabilities and cognitive disabilities joining more and more time in our general education classes. And all this, though this is a smaller group of students with disabilities, we wanted to just show you a little bit of comparison of what access points are, how students who are on an alternate type of learning path really are learning within that framework of the general education curriculum, meaning that we have the regular standards and we have access points. So the access points provide topical relevance, and one way that I love to hear that it's called the core intent of the standard. So the access point really fits into the regular standard, is the same topic, provides meaningful participation, but it's gleaning that core content. So if you would click on, yep. So while we're waiting for that, we want you to think about that some students, in some classes, we might have formalized peer supports, as well as just a normal, natural setting where students with and without disabilities are learning alongside each other. Go to the next one. Yep. Thank you. Okay, so where you see that arrow is the regular standard that students, this is a 5th grade standard, and I'd like to thank Pinewoods Elementary for providing this. They identify the organs in the human body and describe their functions, including the skin, brain, heart, lungs, stomach, liver, intestines, pancreas, all that good stuff, right? And so when you go to the next slide, the arrow is now pointing to one of the access points related to that regular 5th grade standard, okay? Again, focusing on that core content, the student will identify major external and internal body parts, including skin, brain, heart, lungs, stomach, and sensory organs, okay? So it ties right into that regular standard. We're gonna demonstrate that in just a second. Okay, this is just a snapshot of a regular test that some students took a quiz in the class, and they had 13 or 14 matching items. Now here, before you start the video, this is a student from our district, and with his mom's permission, he is a student who has cognitive disabilities, who is included in a general education classroom and is in middle school now. He's in 5th grade in this video. And he worked with his peer buddy to create a life-size model of a human body. And the student was given pictures of each of the organs and labels. The student worked with his teachers and buddies to do a point and say. So while everyone else did that matching quiz, the peer buddy and he also made this body and then presented it to the whole class. So you see that there's mutual benefit to all the students in the class in studying the organs of the body. And in this video, I know we don't have, the sound isn't playing, but his friend is asking him where the different organs are, and he's pointing to them, and he's getting them correct, by the way. And so his teacher could give him a grade, and actually others were probably studying the same material at the same time. His name is Amir. His mom said it's okay to tell you, and he is has been successfully included and is a student on access points.
Want Rachel to tell you the end of the video after he has successfully named all of these body parts at access points?
I would love to. Wish we could have the sound. Yeah.
So you can't hear that point, but they're very
Okay.
also excited Amir is working on these doesn't mean that there aren't other students in that class who are also supported by that extra support by learning those. So the other students may learn 50% more, but this learning experience and watching Amir participate and go through those is actually also supporting their learning on the organs that Amir is working on.
And thank you, Cassandra. You said you'd be able to send that out so they can hear the sound on it in the future. Okay, great, thank you.
So we are very lucky that Lee County has now become home to 2 international organizations. One is Special Olympics. Don has been a longtime ESE teacher in our district, and he has taken on the role as the coordinator for Parks and Recs and Special Olympics. And this year alone, they've created something called Unified Sports. And Unified Sports links students with intellectual disabilities with other peers to participate in group games. So part of their routine is to have about 6 to 8 weeks of practice with that team sport and then compete. And Rachel and I were very lucky that we got to go to the relay races held at South Fort Myers High. The teams were incredibly competitive, just the bonds and the enthusiasm from all the students was incredible. There was one student that was struggling. He kind of reached out his hand. Somebody else grabbed his hand. They ran together in the relay to finish the race. Awards were given out. Prizes were given out. So it was a wonderful day. It's something that has impacted over 1,000 students in our county this year. Whereas Best Buddies is another international organization that just came to Southwest Florida. They've been around forever as well, but within that they have partnered with our elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. Most of the elementary and middle have created supports that will be in the classroom versus the high schools are doing partnerships outside of the classroom. So it's a student with an intellectual disability and one without. One of the activities we got to see from them was when they had their match party. So they learned who their best buddy was going to be, and they got a bag full of fun socks, and they had to find somebody else that had that matching sock. So that was a wonderful event held at Ida Baker High School for Best Buddies. So they are also our collaborative partners, and both Melanie from Best Buddies and Don are here tonight, and they'll be in our breakout rooms as well.
For some of those programs, they actually have non-disabled peers who have to apply because they have so many students who want to participate and be a part of those programs. So with anything that involves change or even good change, there comes hard work and there comes challenges. So we know that along the road we have had barriers that we've had to talk about and find some solutions to. Some of those are flexible scheduling. So you heard Lisa talk a little bit earlier about the process that some schools go through to look at the students that they have, look at the resources that are allocated to their schools to ensure that they have a scheduling process in place that uses those resources most effectively. So that is one of the things we encourage schools to do. At this point, that is optional for schools. So that is a consideration maybe moving forward to have more schools go through that process or a more formalized process. Classroom makeup. How many students should be in a class that do have disabilities? You can't look at every student the same. So even though you might have a classroom that has 5 students with disabilities, not every student has the same level of disability. So some may need very little accommodation or support and some more extensive. But we do need to consider those things because when we have students who have extensive needs and maybe a school didn't go through flexible scheduling, or maybe they have a teacher who's really strong with that population of students, so they put a couple in one classroom. There is a point where that can become really challenging for a teacher when there is extensive accommodation. So those are still things to be considered. Teacher substitute shortage. That is a nationwide issue that we're all facing. That's especially so in special education, where there are different challenges for teachers. We have a lot of teachers who work extremely hard with students with a variety of needs, and we have been lucky to have great supports here in Lee County, but that's not to say that we haven't felt the effects of teacher shortage. So it's how do we get teachers into special education? How do we train them? When we have a lot of teachers who are retiring and we get a new pool of new teachers, how do we make sure that they have the strategies in their tool belts to come right into the classroom as a new teacher and work with a very diverse group of students? Accessing supplementary aids and services. How do we ensure that teachers know what's available to them? In our department, we have a lab. We have 2 people who work with assistive technology. We have, as you've met through this training, inclusion specialists. So how do we ensure that teachers know what's available to them and know how to access those resources? So if they are struggling or they're feeling alone, that there are people out there who can support them and are willing to work with them. People first language. This seems simple, but it's hard. It's talking about people as people first and not the wheelchair kid that comes into my classroom, or not the autistic kid. It's the student with autism. It's the student who uses a wheelchair. These are students. So it's that mindset of not talking about somebody about their disability first, but looking at them as people first. Changing the perception that students who are ESE are going to come in and create a learning situation that's more challenging. Students, individuals anywhere in life can bring a great amount of value and wonderful information and input to a classroom, a community, a job site. So we shouldn't be looking at people who are different than us as not good enough to participate or not having enough value. And it's changing, and I think over time it will continue to change more, but it takes a very concerted approach to think about these things, and to make sure we are using person-first language, and to make sure we are including people, and to make sure that we don't have in our lunchrooms the special ed table or the special ed playground, that we have inclusive things on our campuses for students. Responsible inclusion. So that is not just looking at a state target of 85. We look at it and we know it's important and we work towards it, but not just saying, okay, we have to put 50 more kids into gen ed, like we gotta meet the state target. So these 50, you know, we're going to continue to move forward as is appropriate for students, and making sure that schools can continue to support students and work with students in their area of need. And then extensive accommodations. So when we do have students who need extensive accommodations in the classroom, making sure that, again, that teachers know the resources. And this is also something that we're working on internally in our department, is with the state of Florida. So we have a particular example. I've just worked with a parent this week. We had a parent who had a student who was in a separate classroom, was very successful, and was able to be included part-time, and then was able to increase her inclusion until she was included full-time in 3rd grade. She continued to make all of this progress, but still we're projecting may be unable to pass the FSA, the Florida State Assessment, at the end of the year. And if you're familiar with the statutes, at 3rd grade, it's a mandatory retention for students whether they have a disability or not. So that's something we're working with families and trying to work with our upper level administrators here to see if there's a way that we can get information to the state to say, we want to look at students individually, just like we encourage schools to do when people have disabilities, and we want to make a decision about, even at 3rd grade, if a retention is really appropriate for every student, even if they don't pass a high stakes assessment. So right now, that is the statute, so we follow that, that's the rule, but we want to find a way to have some consideration or have that be reviewed and give us some capacity to look at that individually for students. And then we'll close tonight with just this slide, that inclusion is not about simply about physical proximity. It is about intentionally planning for the success of all students. I know we have a varied audience in here. We have teachers, we have parents, we have community members. This may be completely new to you, or you may be a special education teacher and you know all about this. But if for nothing that you take from this presentation tonight, we hope that you take away that that there is value to including people, and the more that we continue to do that, there's a benefit for all of our students. It is not just about students with disabilities. There is a long-term benefit to making sure that all of the students, disabled or non-disabled, have the skills to work together and do the things they need to do together to be productive members of our society and community when they leave our schools. So thank you. Are we gonna do questions now, or are you gonna?
Let Ms. get,
Okay,
and then we'll do breakout.
okay, great.
Live right here.
Let me use the
I think I
handheld.
have to have.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. If you live out south, then there's a baseball game. Just saying. I love those Twins. Anyway, I'm Gwen Gittens, and I will first address the elephant in the room, which is the teacher issue that comes up all of the time at our board meetings and everywhere. We are working on coming to conclusion, and hopefully we can do that. I see some faces that I've seen at the board meetings. Thank you to those of you that come and speak up for your fellow teachers. And it never hurts to, let us know what you think. And we really want to take to heart everything that you need and want and desire. I have been to several meetings today, and one of them was on housing. It was down in Estero, and it's about affordable housing. And it was a room full of people and business people trying to figure out that same issue. So we are trying to work together with different organizations. And I told them, I said, well, we have a hard enough time getting teachers, and much less finding somewhere for them to live. And there were all types of suggestions, like the small, I call them tiny homes. I know that's not what you call them, but that was one of the suggestions. And I said that would be great for somebody, not me. I'd go crazy. But we're working with different community organizations to see what we can do to enrich the lives of our teachers and therefore attract more. I was reading an article this morning, and it was talking about how Miami-Dade is having the same issue of having finding affordable housing for their teachers. So it's not just us. Everybody wants to come to Florida. And one of the issues they brought up that I thought was very interesting, from the Cape, there was an organization there, and they said they have some property that they could build some housing, multifamily housing. However, the community does not want it. And I said, well, maybe what you need to do is to explain to them that they love their house and they love their yard and they love everything about Florida. And if they want to go to restaurants and get their children taught and have their roads done, it takes people to do that. So we're working to see about how we can help with affordable housing. As far as the teacher issue, I think there's a meeting tomorrow, so gird up your loins and be there. Hopefully we'll hear some more new things coming out, and just know that we are really, really working hard to try to find a happy medium so that everybody can have a living wage and do what is right. I'm trying to think what else we're working on. Tomorrow we have a workshop that is on transparency. I'm sure if we polled everyone in the room, they'd all have a different definition of what it means to be transparent. And of the 7 of us and the superintendent, sometimes that's also the case. So our workshop tomorrow is to define what it looks like, what is transparency, what does transparency look like to you in the community and our employees, and kind of come up with one concise definition so that we're all on the same track. So I'm not putting on this set of glasses and you're putting on that one. I said at the meeting last night, it's like somebody standing on each corner, each of 4 corners, and there's an accident that happens, and the police interview each one of you. They're all going to have a different story. So we've got to find out what is that story so we can all speak the same and see the same things. We're also going to be doing a safety and security workshop, and we will have Sheriff Carmine and Chief Diggs, and we're trying to get all of the law enforcement from the Cape and Bonita and all over to meet with us to talk about for one thing, the Guardian program and our safety and security, because as you know, in Tallahassee, they're talking about it now. We have no idea what's going to come out of that, but we need to be ready and again to be singing off the same page so that the community police and sheriffs and the board and all of us are saying the same things. Any questions for me, Retta? I'm sorry? No, it'll be, we're still setting that up. I think we're trying for the 1st of April to do that. I'm not sure when it'll be yet. Other questions that I might answer? Okay, well, thank you so much, and you'll see me walking around. If you think of something, make sure to ask. Thank you. Is this you?
We still have some time before our breakout sessions. We have approximately 15 minutes or so. If you'd like to entertain some questions from the general audience that people believe apply to all folks as opposed to those that everyone would like to ask and go through in their breakout sessions. If you have a question, please come up to the podium and state your name and school. And as we said at the beginning, try to keep your questions concise. And if no one has questions, oh, there we go.
Up for a question.
I'm Mr. No One. Andy Erickson at the Alva School. I have 2 simple questions. Well, one's might not be so simple, but the first one's on page 3. You have the inclusion increasing the LRE. What's LRE? I'm not a teacher, so I don't know.
So LRE is least restrictive environment, and the LRE is where a student can be served. For some students, the LRE actually might be a center school because that's where they're successful, but it's the greatest extent that they can be out with general education or out and be successful.
And the question is, you're so close to the finishing what the state wants in that chart. What's holding it up? Or what are you working on?
Well, just like we talked about, we have made each year significant gains towards it, but these decisions for inclusion are actually made by IEP teams, and when they make decisions about individual children. So we want them to continue, even though we want to meet that state target, so we're going to continue to provide strategies and support for flexible scheduling. We want them to still make the decision best for the student. So if they indicate that a student is best served in a separate class, or a center school, that is the team decision. However, just like Lisa spoke about, if a student is served in some of these locations, we do still need to look for ways that they can be included. So if you're in a separate class, does not mean that you have to stay all day in that separate class. If you can be successful in math, then you need to be included for math. And we're trying to make some pathways for students that it's not an all or nothing.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth DeMello with Skyline Elementary. I have two questions related to the same thing, flexible scheduling. At the end, I heard you say that's something that is optional. So schools are not required then to look at the needs first as far as where they place their teachers. I just want to make sure I understood that correctly.
So for flexible scheduling, they look at the students and placement of students. So we would want, every school will go through a process to look at where students are placed, but we don't have a required process for schools to go through flexible scheduling. And through that process, they pull IEPs, they look at needs in each IEP. So there might be some things that an individual school is doing. I think, do you know how many schools were supported last year? I think you provided over 40. So over 40 schools receive specialized training, but there is not a mandatory requirement. So a school could go through a very involved process, or they could go through a different process, and that's really optional. So that might be something moving forward as we continue, especially trying to meet that state goal. Maybe that is something to consider, is that do we have schools, maybe we don't require them to go through the most extensive process, but some part of a process where they're really looking very specifically at IEPs.
Okay.
At this point, even though they may go through, it is to go through our department, and our supports are optional. They may go through their own process to do that.
Okay, thank you. My second question, I can ask a second my second question is funding. And I've had the pleasure, and it really has been a pleasure, of working in a special needs area for a couple of years now, and in an SE room, and I have a child in an SF room, so I've got exposure to both sides of that. And I'm just curious, when you have students at an SE level who obviously bring in more state money, more government money, because they have higher needs, their needs are definitely greater than the ones in the SF or general education classes, how do we determine, or how is it determined, the funding? How do we determine how many teachers? I mean, I know there's ratios for this class has 10 kids. They are technically allowed to have this many. But my question is, if you have an SE room with one teacher and one para, and you have 10 children, and you have an SF room with 10 children or 11 children and 2 paras and a teacher, how is that determined? How can we fix that? Is it the school that takes the funding and here's the money I have, so I'm going to decide who goes where based on need? Or is it at the district level that it's decided, okay, this class is an SE class, so it should have this many paras and a teacher for that many students?
Well, first, before answering that, thank you for the time that you're spending in our classroom, and then as a parent and being here and sharing, because we need people who are committed and really appreciate, it sounds like you enjoy that job and the time that you are able to spend with individuals who might have some special needs. So in regards to funding, you can't look at a student in a category to say, even though a student who is an SE, that's social emerging. So that's one of our programs for students with autism who have emerging skills. So they may be nonverbal or have very limited verbal. They may do things and need quite a bit of support, adult support. SF is a classroom that is social functioning, and all those students in that class also typically on the spectrum, but it's not only students on the spectrum, but if they're in that classroom, they are typically working below grade level, but on more traditional academic type things. They may be working on more of a life skills type thing. So when you're looking at those two classrooms, you may assume that because those students have more needs in SC, that they generate more funding, but that is not necessarily the case. So every time an IEP team creates a new plan, they also complete post-meeting based on the IEP, the individual education plan, which is something every student served in special education has. They have different areas. So the funding is generated based on your need across multiple areas. So even though you're a student that may have extremely significant academic needs, if you don't have academic needs, health needs, independent functioning needs, medical needs, you may not generate more funding. So it really depends on your needs across areas. And those fundings are set by the state, and money does go directly to schools, and it does support things in your school like your teachers, your paraprofessional, your occupational therapist, your speech language pathologist, and then also through the federal grant for IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act. We have some additional funding that supports behavior specialists and other specialty areas, which will help support some of the individuals that you saw tonight, like the learning resource specialist. The district sets, and nothing is 100%, because whenever you're dealing with special education, there's areas that make each classroom unique. But a standard classroom might have a teacher and a paraprofessional, and then additional supports may be added as needed. But typically, if we're involved in that process, we'll look at the school as a whole and see what supports you have. If you have a behavior specialist, if you are a school that has certain social communication supports that are available at school. So we look at that picture as a whole. And then additionally, the IEP teams at times will look at specialized needs that individual students have. And then when the team has those as part of a plan, then the school is required to provide them. And if the school feels like they don't have the resources to meet all of those needs with what they currently have, then they'll reach out to us, and then we work collaboratively with the budget department to see how to help support that school or classroom.
Perfect. That absolutely answered my question. Thank you.
Scott Hertz on behalf of Gulf Middle. I appreciate very much you included in the materials the research studies that showed that the impact of having students with disabilities in classrooms does not appear to have a negative effect on other children. I know at my school we've experienced there are children that do not have intellectual disabilities. In fact, they're very high functioning intellectually. They get 5s on their FSAs, but they have certain behavioral problems and disruptive issues that absolutely, at least on a day-to-day basis, impact the classroom. And what we hear at our school is there's frustration among the teachers that they at least express they don't feel there's something they can do about it, or at least they don't understand what they can do about it. And then parents certainly, whether studies bear this out or not, certainly feel like their children's education is being negatively impacted. You get the stories about this kid throws a temper tantrum and tosses, flips his table over, throws his chair across the room, and storms out, and there's no teaching going on for some period of time. And some of these, some of the classrooms experience this on a weekly basis. And so my question for you is perhaps to address that, and as well as what tools are there, and what should schools be doing to get their teachers the tools to address those types of issues, and how do you feel that impacts that type of inclusion and the impact on the other students in the classroom? Thank you.
So there's a couple of questions in there, so I'll try to remember them all. But the first point I just want to clarify is that the student you're describing, where a student can have a behavior that might be disruptive in a class and could actually be very disruptive, would not necessarily be limited to a student with a disability. So that could be any type of student who has certain needs or behaviors that they're trying to meet a need with. But in terms specifically for students with disabilities. Because a good portion of our department is funded through a grant, we have services. So tonight you heard from 2 of our learning resource specialists who are specific to inclusion. Well, they do many things, but inclusion is their priority. We also have learning specialists for behavior. So there are resources if a school says, we've exhausted what we know, we need some outside eyes to come in and give us some suggestions. That's one way to go. I would say typically when we go in a school, if I talk to an administrator or I talk to a group of teachers, I can find a teacher of any group, and having been a school-based administrator as well, who'll say, I never have a problem with that child. And so I would suggest that teams look at what that teacher does differently, because sometimes it's the strategies that those people have. It's their process in the classroom. It's how they structure students for transition, how they prepare them for work, how they provide choice in a classroom instead of saying, here's your sheet, hey, you can choose to answer it by writing a song, or you can do a written activity. So they do some things like that. But I'm sure if you find some teachers in the school who don't seem to have as many challenges, it's not that their makeup of students is different, because they're teaching the same students. It's their strategies. So you have experts actually right in your school. But if you want outside people, we have those as well. We also offer a number of trainings. So this is another function of fiddlers that we talked about before. They do a considerable amount of professional development. They have a 60-hour course in behavior. We also, through ESE, have started offering this year classes every Thursday night from 5 to 7 here at the main building. Many of them are related to behavior, because we know that that's something that teachers always have a lot of questions about. So those are face-to-face, because as many virtual opportunities as we've had, we heard from teachers that sometimes they just want to see and talk to a person, and they want to ask a specific question about something. So we have actually offered those all year and have had pretty much a full house every Thursday. So that's been something that we were excited that teachers took advantage of that opportunity. Now, that being said, although it's a full house, it's a classroom of 30, and we have a really large district, so proportionally, if we had more teachers, we'd find a bigger space. So we want as many people to access those as possible, paraprofessionals as well. So we don't just offer them administrators, paraprofessionals, teachers, they are open to anybody. Behaviorally, any more input? We also offer the autism endorsement. We were one of the first districts in Florida to be able to offer that to our teachers, so we're very proud of that. It's four 60-credit classes, and if you take all 4, that will lead to the endorsement, and there one is a class specific there to behavior. But again, a lot of times it's not about behavior change, because if you're just trying to change the person, you're probably not going to be successful. It's more about what can you change in your environment that's going to help support that individual. So.
Thank you. And I think that will take us to our breakouts. It's my understanding that we're going to have folks to come to each of the breakout sessions, and we're actually going to have an interactive. That's where we're going to do the interactive portion to solicit feedback in the breakout groups from us to do that. So if everyone wants to go ahead and proceed to their rooms, we will move forward. Thank you. All right, we're going to wrap up here with our breakout group reports. It's my understanding that elementary school discovered that the BIPE is available online, and Cassandra's going to send out a link to all of us as part of the follow-up from the meeting about that. Middle school, I believe, does not have a report at this time. All of their issues were addressed, and they didn't come up with any issues to bring forward to the group. So that brings us to high school.
Really, we spoke about teacher certification. They answered the question with the 20 hours. Our question is 20 hours enough? And did the teachers have any extra time to do something like this? That's it. Right?
All right, and so that takes us to public comment from non-DAC members on non-agenda items. Seeing none, does anybody have anything for the good of the order? And I will happily entertain a motion for adjournment. Mr. Erickson, and a second. All those in favor? All right, and our next meeting will be April 17th. See everybody then.